Good morning, everybody. John Bedell here live at the Warren County Courthouse in Lebanon, where the jury, the audience of 12 that has been sitting in this jury box all trial long in Brooke Skylar Richardson's murder trial, now has this case for deliberations. They got the case at about 11:15 this morning. We saw more than a week of testimony. Closing arguments were this morning, and now they are deliberating about what their verdicts will be in this high-profile murder trial that we've been covering for more than a week. I've been on this case, this legal saga, for more than 2 years now, and have followed every step of this story along the way, and now every step of this trial. So I've got a legal expert who's going to join me here in a second. We are going to get to some questions, the most common questions we've gotten from you, our viewers, throughout this trial on our Facebook page about what's going on here, the sequence of events, key moments in this trial, the key facts of this case that this jury will have to consider. So let's do a recap, because there are several key dates in this case. This all started back in April of 2017. On April 26th of 2017, Skylar Richardson went to her OBGYN. It's called Hilltop OBGYN here in the Cincinnati area. And she went to get birth control pills. And she also, what turned out to happen in that appointment was she had her suspicions of being pregnant confirmed. She said she thought she might have been pregnant. And at this appointment, this OBGYN, her doctor, confirmed to her that she was pregnant, and in fact, in the third trimester of a pregnancy. Then, 11 days later, in the early morning hours of May 7th, Skylar Richardson gave birth to her daughter at home, and then she later buried the child's body in the backyard. Neither of those two facts have been disputed in this case. What is at the crux of the argument here is, was this child stillborn, as Skylar and her defense team have claimed, or what prosecutors argue is that she murdered her daughter before she buried the body. Then, a couple months go by. On July 12th, Skylar shows up to her OB's practice, seeing a different doctor than she had seen back in April, but these two doctors had consulted about her earlier visit, and she shows up with no baby. So this OB basically says, hey, wait a minute, you were here in April, in your third trimester of a pregnancy, where's the baby? And at that point, her OB testified that is when Skylar admitted to her she gave birth at home on May 7th, had a stillborn child, her daughter, and buried the body in the backyard. That prompted 2 days later, now that Friday, for that OBGYN to call Carlisle Police and the Warren County Sheriff's Office and relay Skylar's account of what happened to them. That is when Skylar did her first police interview. And as you might remember, that was the day investigators got the first search warrant of the Richardson home here in Warren County in Carlisle. Then they had the remains examined. That led to a second police interrogation with Richardson, where she confessed to maybe killing the baby after it was maybe alive for 5 minutes, and also confessed trying to cremate the baby a little bit. Her defense argues that was a false confession that was coerced out of her by police. She was arrested that afternoon. She was charged in Franklin Municipal Court. A few weeks later, she was indicted, and now here we are. So joining me for this trial is Cincinnati-based defense attorney Mark Crumbine. Mark has been following this case every step of the way. Mark, you've been in court every day. First of all, for our viewers, Mark, give them a sense of your credentials in terms of your experience as a defense attorney.
Well, I've been a criminal defense attorney for 36 years. Before that, I was briefly a prosecutor, and I've handled dozens and dozens of murder cases, at least a dozen capital murder cases specifically, and in federal and state court.
So first of all, Mark, I know our viewers are wondering, because this came up really for the first time explicitly in the closing arguments today, the prosecution admitting this is a case of circumstantial evidence as opposed to direct evidence. What does that mean?
Well, direct evidence is when you have a witness that actually sees what's happening and then recounts it for the jury. Circumstantial evidence is when you look at the evidence or situation and then can deduct things from it. And for instance, the defense attorney used the example, if you put a cat and a mouse in a box and it's a closed box, and you open it 10 minutes later and the mouse is gone, you can assume that the cat ate the mouse. So that's like an example of strong circumstantial evidence. Nobody saw the cat eat the mouse. Nobody was videotaping it, recording, but almost for darn sure it happened. So that's what that sort of is.
And you heard the prosecution tell the jury, look, direct and circumstantial evidence, you need to those both carry the same weight. They also used the pieces of the puzzle analogy. Does that tend to come up a lot, Mark, in a circumstantial evidence case? And do direct and circumstantial evidence do, in fact, carry the same weight to a jury, or should they?
Well, yes, by law they should, and the jury's instructed to do that. Now, that doesn't mean if it can be disbelieved, and it could be weak, or it could be strong. So it's just like an eyewitness. If there's not enough light, if the eyewitness has poor vision, that's credibility, or just that can be an issue too. So you asked about the
pieces of the puzzle analogy. Does that come up a lot in a circumstantial evidence case?
Yes. The prosecution is saying, well, there's still a puzzle. If some of the pieces are missing, you can still see what the puzzle is about. But as a defense attorney, I would say each and every element of the crime has to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. So if you consider a puzzle elements of a crime and the pieces are missing, then you do not have a complete puzzle and it should be not guilty. That would be the counter argument to the prosecution's proposal.
We hear beyond a reasonable doubt a lot. You see it on TV in these crime dramas. You hear it a ton in court. But in layman's terms, Mark, as an attorney yourself, what does beyond a reasonable doubt mean? What should a jury be considering when the judge and the defense in particular are telling them, and even the prosecution bringing up beyond a reasonable doubt? What does that mean?
Well, beyond a reasonable doubt means you would have enough evidence that in the most serious circumstances of your own life, it would be sufficient. And everybody sort of has their examples, but that is no doubt a very high standard. It's the highest standard of proof of law in the United States. In civil cases like over money or even taking a child from a family does not have that high of a burden of proof. So that's serious business, and attorneys have their different ways of explaining it, and it is a little hard to understand for anybody, but basically if my example sometimes if a child is having an operation and a doctor says, well, this could kill the child, but also if the child doesn't have the surgery, the child could die too. That's about as serious as it would get in a normal person's life. So that's how this is supposed to be taken, just very, very seriously. But there is no perfect, nobody can say 100% that anything happened, and the prosecutors love to point that out, of course.
Another key issue here is, people want to talk about what was actually presented, what was the evidence we saw. One of the sticking points, I think, here, Mark, is that when it comes to this being a circumstantial evidence, a tough point for the prosecutors is that they have not been able to determine a medical cause of death for this child. I remember Warren County Prosecutor David Fornshell said in the early days of this case, before she was even indicted, Mark, he said, look, we don't have, and we may not ever have, a medical cause of death for this child. How exactly did this baby girl die? And that came up in trial. We've had experts say, all the experts we heard that testified about this, pathologists, anthropologists, said we can determine no cause of death. What struck you about that being the case, that they don't have a medical cause of death for this baby?
Well, to me that is troublesome. You've got most of the baby's bones. There's no trauma to the bones. So, what caused it? And as you said, John, the prosecutor was talking about, well, it could be like drowning or suffocation. Well, it could be, or it could be a stillborn. I mean, to me, that's almost an automatic amount of reasonable doubt. And that's not the typical strength of a murder case. Usually murders are only indicted on like the strongest of evidence because, the punishment for any murder in Ohio is either the death penalty, which does not apply here, or life in prison. You can't get any more serious than that. And even though the standard of proof is the same in every criminal case from a misdemeanor all the way to a major felony, sometimes jurors will say, hey, if the charge is great enough, you better make sure you really prove it. And that's sort of completely missing here.
And we really saw a lot of experts disagree on a couple of the key points. One, the pathologist from the Montgomery County Coroner's Office who did the official autopsy, she ruled the the manner of death, was it undetermined homicidal violence? She said the cause of death, undetermined. But then the state had a second anthropologist who testified, Mark, as you saw. Again, she agreed with the undetermined cause of death, but manner, she said, no, there is no evidence that I could find of a homicide on this infant's remains. She is an expert on skeletons and on bones. As you mentioned, the prosecution's argument as well, if she was suffocated or drowned, there wouldn't be evidence of that, and that's not to say that that didn't happen, but there's going to be no evidence of the bones. Also, we saw a disagreement on another medical point, Mark, the fact that whether this child was stillborn or not. The OBGYN that the defense called yesterday said his ruling was this was a stillborn baby. But the OBGYN that the state called last week, Dr. Brady, he said, I have no way to tell whether this was a stillborn or not. Is that another sticking point here medically for the prosecution?
Yes. The stillborn baby issue is paramount because the first three charges, as Mr. Ritkers pointed out for his defendant, are that if the baby is not born live, it can't be an aggravated murder, it can't be child endangering, it can't be anything except abuse of a corpse at that stage. So, there's no, I don't, even watching this carefully myself in the lead up like you have done, it's not clear to me how they can, say for sure whether it was a stillborn or not. Dr. White, that was the defense witness, OB-GYN, he said, well, because of her, it was only thought to be a 32-week baby and it was really full term, so the baby was too small, the mother's small, the umbilical cord was not connected as far as anyone knows, and the mother wasn't doing any prenatal care. He's like, he thought it was a stillborn. And I think that's not a bad conclusion. It's not perfect, but it's not a bad conclusion. And then, so that was helpful to the defense. And and then the fact that the state is really relying on non-scientific evidence to say that the child is alive. And let's think about that for a minute. What they're doing is, in the second argument, they are saying that the second interview, they are saying that the mother said, well, the baby might have moved its arm, baby might have cried, baby might have gurgled, baby might have been alive for up to 3 minutes, might have. But by the way, might have could arguably not be proof beyond a reasonable doubt, might have, because, so they're getting most of their evidence on the live birth from the statements of Skylar Richardson, the defendant, and the defense is getting most of their argument from on stillbirth or not from an OB-GYN reviewing all the records, even Skylar's statements. But he's saying that it is a stillborn.
And that dovetails nicely into the last couple things I want to ask you about, which both of these questions have to do with the family, where in terms of who we saw from Skylar's family who testified, we saw her brother and her father. Yesterday, her brother he testified, and he was a character witness. He talked about his relationship with Skylar. He talked about how she was her best friend, and he said this has been a long 2 years for our family. We just want everything to go back to normal. So that his testimony was pretty short yesterday. Mostly he's a character witness. But Dad was a real shock to hear, Mark, because we did not expect him, because of the separation of witnesses rule, that basically if you're a witness, you can't be in the courtroom before your testimony, because basically they don't want your testimony tainted or changed by anything somebody before you on the stand has to say. But we later found out that Judge Oda, as we talked about earlier this week, used his discretion, said I'll allow it, and he was able to be in the courtroom. But Dad said he was asked by Charlie Ritkers, the son of the father-son team, he was asked, what is your greatest regret in life, Mark? And he said what?
The father of Skylar Richardson said, my greatest regret in life is that I didn't get an attorney for my daughter for the second interview. And I don't know about the rest of his life, but I would tend to agree with him. That was a major disaster for Skylar. And you can't, the defense can't gloss over the fact that she, again, talked about baby's arm might have moved, might have cried, might have gurgled, might have been alive for 5 minutes. That was all devastating to her. It also caused, very frankly, the coroner to come up with a homicide finding.
Which the coroner said. She said part of my ruling on undetermined homicidal violence was some of the statements that she gave police in that interview.
And she made it seem like that was a huge part. And without that interview, I don't think there would have been a finding of homicide, and we probably wouldn't even be standing here right now.
And in fact, I should correct myself. It wasn't the coroner in Montgomery County. It was a pathologist who works for the Montgomery County Coroner's Office. She was the one who did the autopsy and actually made the ruling of undetermined homicidal violence.
That's right.
And then that piggybacks, that is at the center, Mark, of what's one of the things that's at the center of this case. We heard another expert testify about the false confession narrative. Was this, as her defense team argues, a false confession forced out of Tyler after intimidation and some pressure by deputies? This psychologist they had testify yesterday who evaluated Skylars said she's got a personality disorder that makes her more susceptible to cave to suggestions from authority figures. They argue that is what's going on here. The prosecution says, how could she possibly have said these things and admitted to these horrible things if she didn't actually do them? That's going to be a sticking point. What the jury, who the jury believes in that argument here, Mark.
Well, it is a sticking point, and maybe the most serious one of the whole case. We saw her first interview where she kept saying, I didn't do anything. The baby was stillborn. I didn't harm the baby. But then when her parents come in and the recorder's still on, she does say, I tried to cremate the baby. And she also, the first interview, she's like, I didn't kill the baby. And some people are wondering, well, they didn't ask her if she killed the baby, but she right away sort of blurts that out. I didn't kill the baby. So anyway, so that could be that is going to be a major issue, because in the second interview, they're actually the second interview, she's already like slipping and saying, well, baby might have been breathing, could have been alive for up to 5 minutes, maybe gurgled, things like that. So had she had an attorney, then they would not have allowed her to make damaging statements like that, and would have, been there, and that probably would have been the end of the interview.
And that's going to be, I think that was powerful for the jury to see, because we had heard these accounts, at least generically, from prosecutors and read them in court documents, Mark, but to see that and to see Skylar on video, the emotion of that, and look, it's going to be, I thought that was tough for the defense to have aired in court, because she makes some damning statements, Mark, in that video. It's just, what does the jury, that audience of 12, believe about, well, was it a false confession, or do they agree with prosecutors if that's a legit murder confession? So we'll see what they do. Last question, and we've been pulling these all from you, our viewers. These are basically a collection of some of the most common questions we've gotten throughout this trial that we've gotten on Facebook as we've live streamed. And Mark, everybody wants to know about Skylar's mom, Kim Richardson. She has been front and center of this, I can tell you, since following this from the early days, since day one. When she was indicted, David Fornshell sort of threw under the bus a couple times by name during his indictment press conference, talking about how she felt such a pressure of the image that she had to maintain. She felt that pressure from mom, and Skylar felt keeping this baby wasn't an option because, talk of the Richardson girl was pregnant in their community would not be something that Fornshell said at the time would not be acceptable, particularly to mom. People want to know why she was not in the courtroom. First of all, the separation of witnesses rule did apply to her, Mark, because she was subpoenaed by the prosecution, and as such, she was not allowed to be in the courtroom before any potential testimony. The state did not call her. When they rested their case, the defense took over, and she was obviously not called by the defense, but the state still had a chance for rebuttal witnesses. They said, no, we're not going to call any rebuttal witnesses, so she ended up, Mark, being out of the courtroom for the entire trial. She wasn't allowed to be in there. She wasn't allowed to follow coverage. We did see Kim in the courtroom for the first time today because the presentation of evidence was finished and it was just closing arguments. But people want to know why mom did not testify. A lot of people said they were interested in seeing what she had to say. What do we know about why she was not called to testify by the state?
Well, the prosecution had said a lot about her, and I agree, threw her under the bus already. The defense was, talking about it too, and they were saying statements that were sort of damaging to mom. Mom was the problem for Skylar's, personality disorder, making her concentrate on her looks and appearance and weight, things like that, and social status, things of that nature. So the defense was throwing her under the bus pretty well too, and they had to. And so the question about why she didn't end up taking the stand for the state or the defense, so much evidence had come in already that about what she would have said. We knew everything except her favorite color by the time the case ended. We already knew so much about her, what she would have said. At a certain point, the defense probably said, hey, we've made all our positives just through the state's case, through psychologists, through, other evidence. So at this point, through friends of the family, through her, so at that point, I guess they didn't even want to take the risk of putting her on, because then maybe she would have said something to try to, that might have countered what their theme was.
Yeah, because we even saw the state in their opening statements last week on Wednesday say they promised us you are going to hear more about what they said was the dysfunctional relationship, was the quote they used, between Skylar and Mom throughout this trial. We certainly heard a lot about it, Mark. As you mentioned, we heard a ton about Mom in this trial, but eventually the state decided not to call her. Do you think that prosecutors just didn't see any advantage to calling her up at some point?
Well, sometimes a defense attorney or a prosecutor will subpoena somebody just in case they think they might need her, might need them. But you do that because if you don't, then you don't have the chance to have them testify. So that doesn't mean that they were always like dead set on using her. So that's not surprising. And I know everybody, I know the Facebook, the listeners and viewers want to sort of hear straight from the horse's mouth everything, but a lot of times for strategic reasons, attorneys don't allow that to happen.
Mark Crumbine, Cincinnati area defense attorney, thank you for joining us and giving us your time and your insight, Mark.
Thank you.
Following the trial since day one, so that's going to wrap up our broadcast here from the Warren County Courthouse. It's the jury has had this case for deliberation since 11:15 this morning. On Thursday morning, they have had this case for deliberations. We'll be here. We'll be following this case. The deliberations will let you know when the jury has a decision and what that verdict is. So we hope you'll stay with us for continuing coverage of the Brooke Skylar Richardson trial here at the Warren County Courthouse. For now, I'm reporting live here in Lebanon. I'm John Bedell, News Center 7.